War is hell. That quote from William Tecumseh Sherman has been proven time and again, and it was never as true as in the story I'm about to tell you. It is a story that is horrific, ghastly, intensely sad, brutally ugly, and utterly and completely forgotten. Some of you will be sickened by it. Some of you will be haunted, the same way I was when I first heard it. You'll be going to sleep 2 months from now, and as you close your eyes, the images I'm about to paint for you are going to come swimming up out of the darkness. And you'll get that shiver that comes from the uncanny, the unnerving. A few of you will call it BS, and you'll laugh and say it's stupid, say it's sick, say it should be forgotten, that this story should be relegated to the dustbin. Thank God, you'll say. The world has changed. But has it? Truth is, all wars, all conflicts bring their own horrors. World War I's trenches and mustard gas, World War II's death camps and beachheads. This story took place during a war that few people talk about today. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871. It wasn't a long war, lasted roughly 6 months, but it was a brutal one. The conflict was between the Second French Empire and the North German Confederation. But the circumstances, the intricacies of this war aren't important to this story. That's because this one is primal. War was the cause, but survival, raw survival, was at its sad core. Truth is, this story could have taken place in any battle between two human groups, from Neolithic tribespeople to technically advanced modern soldiers. While the details of what these two armies were fighting over aren't important to the events of this story, the landscape, the place, is fundamental. First, I need to say a few words about the man who recorded this event. His name was Leon Blois, and Blois was a piece of work. Here is where we have our first little hurdle. See, Blois was a novelist and raconteur, and he wrote this dark tale, along with others like it, in a book of short stories. This story comes from his book Sweating Blood, first published in 1893. I highly recommend Eric Butler's incredible translation and useful introduction in Wakefield Press's 2016 edition. Blois wasn't interested in documenting history so much as revealing universal certainties. But that isn't to say these stories didn't actually happen. Truth is, they were based on his own experience as an irregular soldier, like other militiamen pulled from Parisian shooting clubs into battle. The stories also came from news articles he read and collected, as well as anecdotes he was told, words he overheard whispered between shell-shocked soldiers in cafes and bars. Born in 1846 in France, Blois had a miserable childhood, and through a series of unhappy events, became an outspoken and vicious critic of Catholicism. He would rage against the church any chance he had until, in 1868, he met a writer who changed the course of his life. Blois suddenly had an overnight conversion and became an instant, die-hard Catholic. Strange, yes, but he was a strange guy. Despite his newfound religiosity, it didn't change the fact that he was angry and bitter. And he pissed off almost everyone he met. The guy was a reckoning. What made him so angry? The world, for a start, and people, and how people behave, and the values people have, and the things that they say. Pretty much all humanity enraged him. This was because to Blois, people are all basically irredeemable. Very few were able to live up to the extreme moral standards he tried to uphold. Tried being the operative word here. Because as much as Blois raved and ranted about the sins of the flesh and purity, the man had love affairs with sex workers, one of whom, Maurice, lost her mind and would whisper to him all the horrific visions she'd experience. Visions so powerful, Blois said he was haunted by them all the way to his deathbed. As pure as the dude wanted to be, he just couldn't shake sin. One of his most famous quotes is, "The only real sadness, the only real failure, the only great tragedy in life is not to become a saint." Blois also took literally Jesus' teaching that it was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to get into heaven. For him, only the poor and the suffering were worthy of our respect. And suffering, well, that was the pinnacle of worldly experience. The more you suffer, the more God smiles upon your hideous flesh. That's where our story comes in. Blois titled it The Mud, but a more fitting name would be The Epitaph, because that's what it's about, because that's what they called her, the call girl with no face, the Epitaph. This happened at some untold point during the Franco-Prussian War in Camp Conley, which was one of a number of camps set up in the swampy fields of Brittany in the far northwest of France. Camp Conley is little known today, but if it is spoken about, it is in regards to the atrocities that went on there. Namely, the fact that the camp itself was built upon recently plowed fields that, when the monsoons came, quickly turned into calf-deep wastelands of mud. Picture this: tens of thousands of soldiers camped out in miles and miles of mud. Mud as far as the eye can see. Vast plains of endless mud. And we're not talking about the slippy, slidey mud you find on the edge of your lawn after a rainstorm. We're talking about sucking mud, mud that clings, mud that devours, mud that, if you fall into it and no one is around to help you get up, you're gonna asphyxiate. In some places, the mud was waist deep. Other places, even deeper. Despite having tents and gear, one horrifying realization made itself clear. In this sea of mud, you could not lie down. These men, the tens of thousands of them, had to stand. For days, for weeks. They worked as they could, tending to their horses, their artillery. Then they ate what meager meals were available, and then attempted to sleep, leaning up against each other like stacks of wood, beyond exhaustion, their mud-caked limbs trembling. You can imagine how frayed their nerves were. Disease quickly spread through the camp. The place was alive with flies, the surface of the mud squirming with maggots that fed on the liquefying bodies of horses and oxen that had become stuck and died. Smallpox, bronchitis, dysentery, puke, piss, diarrhea, blood from weeping ulcers, all of it mixed into the ever-present, never-draining mud. Hundreds of soldiers died. But it wasn't just the mud, the disease, the stench. No, the worst enemy was the waiting. These soldiers weren't fighting. They were on pause, holding. Their battle was with time, with the greatest enemy of sanity, boredom. They did what they could to keep busy. They marched. They tried fitfully to clean their clothes. They attempted hopelessly to keep their gear free of mud. In their off hours, they played cards, read, sang. It did help that they were not completely alone out in the fields. There were villages near Camp Conley, tiny fly-blown places, and those villagers saw opportunity where the thousands of mud-trapped soldiers saw despair. For a small price, They dragged barrels of cheap ale on ox carts to the plains of mud. The soldiers got as drunk as they could and sang late into the night, drowning their sorrows, drinking to kill the fuzzy numbness in their legs. Some got sloppy. They passed out, tumbled over, too drunk to keep their faces above the muck, and vanished beneath it. Their bodies were crushed unseen under the boots of their countrymen. But it wasn't just drink. There were women of the night as well. Most of them would meet with their clients on solid ground, the woods, the villages, surrounding the mud plains. But there were a desperate few who would make their way out into the nightmare world of Camp Conley and do the deed in the mud itself. One of them was a young woman called the Epitaph. Epitaph means an inscription on a tombstone, but it originally meant funeral elegy. It's a sick joke, really, essentially suggesting that this unnamed woman was your tombstone, your death poem. Why? Because she basically had no face. It isn't entirely clear what disease truly afflicted the Epitaph. Blois describes her as decomposing right in front of you, her snout covered with crust, ravaged by phthisis, her skin pulled tight to her skull. Phthisis was at one time called consumption. It is pulmonary tuberculosis, which causes wasting and substantial weight loss. People suffering from it can have their faces ravaged, the skin sunken, the skin gray, lips blue, eyes milky. They can develop lesions, ulcers, cracked, broken, and destroyed skin. Regardless of what the Epitaph had, it's very likely she was quite uncomfortable and very sick. As Blois tells it, the Epitaph was the lover of an older soldier. He protected her out of pity and had her stationed in a supply wagon that the other soldiers would visit. According to Blois, she was very popular. The supply wagon was a particularly horrible place. It was deep in the mudflats, the wheels immobilized. The horse that had drawn it had died and fallen on its side. With advancing putrefaction, the horse's body bloated, its legs sticking up into the sky like ship masts on an ocean of filth. This made the supply wagon easy to find, but Blois writes that due to the liquefaction of the horse's flesh, it was nearly impossible to tell where the horse ended and the thick mud began. Blois even jokes that men would jostle for their turn with the Epitaph inside the wagon and try to knock each other down into the bluish-tinged puddle beneath the front wheels, this puddle being what remained of the rotting horse's chest cavity. But the Epitaph wasn't just relegated to the supply wagon. There were times, Blois writes, where she moved about the camp at night to visit those men who couldn't make it to the wagon. How did she do this? Via a sled that was made from knotted ropes. Blois writes that it resembled a bier to convey bodies, meaning the movable frame on which a coffin is placed. You can imagine the Epitaph dragging along the surface of this infinite sea of foul mud on a little sled, her skull-like head gleaming in the moonlight as she makes her way tent to tent. Sadly, the Epitaph's nickname was quite appropriate. According to Blois, the whole situation was, quote, too good to last, unquote. One night, while away from the supply wagon, on her rounds of the distant soldiers' tents, she was in the amorous embraces of a rather heavy-set guy. The man was so wrapped up in his endeavors that he failed to notice the Epitaph sinking beneath him into the mud. She was swallowed up entirely, her screams muffled, her thrashing limbs entombed. Her body was never found. Blois writes that the men of the camp went crazy afterwards. Some even dispatched themselves in despair. Some tore their tents down, tossed their weapons. He even suggests that this incident is why the camp was ultimately abandoned. So who was the Epitaph? What was her name? Where did she come from? It's very likely we will never know. This story is just one of dozens of terrible anecdotes that Blois recounts in his books and writings. For him, it is symbolic of man's disgusting and brutal nature. It is a message, a wake-up call. But looking back at it, now more than 150 years later, we can see a different story, a struggle for survival in the worst of places, in the most unimaginable of circumstances. It is uncannily impressive how tenacious, how strong people can be in the midst of suffering. Leon Blois died in 1917, ranting and raving until the very end. This is Medium-Sized Ghost. Salutations.